Testing, 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 testing. All right, this is a writing session. I've streamed once before. Um, and I'm not used to it, but I'm sort of bored and I figured I'd try it out again. And I'm just gonna be writing. Okay, so this is about aesthetics, the follow-up video to my essay on art styles. And I already have a lot of it written. Um, so this is on page 15 already, and I'm trying to pivot from talking about media as art and media as categorical entities. And I need to pivot to the wheel of relation, which is something that was in my systematizing emotions video, and then applying that to aesthetics. So I want to argue that there's the aesthetic and there's the normative disposition towards this towards aesthetics. Similar to that, there was an aesthetic and normative disposition towards emotions in that essay. Um, so I need to establish what I mean by aesthetics and what I mean by normative before talking about the figure. Normativity is not descriptive and therefore lacks criticism. Of art is good, says nothing about its nature. Words like sublime or exquisite are more valuable, not because of their normativity, but because of the descriptive connotation embedded in their normativity. A sublime piece of art is not just good, but is a metaphysically elevated form of good. Exquisite works of art are not just good, but are descriptively elegant and fine. So I'm trying to say that aesthetics is related to description, but is more specifically tonal in description. Whereas normativity is a polar axis, um, and is related to interest in terms of desire. I just don't know how I'm gonna transition into. So before that, I'm talking about the role of design as art. The book Design as Art by Bruno Munari. I haven't finished that section, but I'm gonna talk a little bit here about prophilicity and how fine artists and not and like lower artists both have to engage in social media and those sorts of media platforms in order to gain prophilicity, in order to be relevant in society. Um, but it just feels like a hard pivot into aesthetics and normative, so I have to transition properly. I'm already talking about interestedness and disinterestedness earlier. Um, So I can't really use that as the pivot. Maybe I should work on that instead. Okay, so I talk about beauty, page 4, compare it to formalism. But then I need to sort of bring that topic back in order to talk about aesthetics and normativity. So that's those. I haven't written this part either. Um, I have this whole section in my notes about medium and message, or form and content, and how they're related to each other. Um, but it feels like page 3 is too early to get into that, so I should do that later. After I've established more of what I'm talking about. Um, so the hardest part about writing is structuring. So after I talk about categories, could I talk about form and content? Um, okay, so I'm talking about a novel as an example and form and content. So at the first level of analysis, the form of the novel is its technological and historical placement, which is like a meta analysis of what a novel is. It's something that's embedded in society, not just an object, it's not just art, it's not just media. Um, it's it's an entity that's historical. And then the content of that form is the physical book. And then the next level of analysis, the next scope, the physical book itself, which was the content, becomes the form. So the material and the efficient cause of the actuality of the bound pages becomes a form. And the content of that is written language or English. And so there's this nested form and content. Um, Content of the physical form of the media must be accessed in order to reveal itself as form, carrying with it more nested content. The medium of a message is a meta message of formal containment. Within the medium of language, which is the content of the physical novel, there exists the semantic content of the word signified by linguistic form. Diction is the author's paradigmatic selection of words. Fantastic may be substituted for wonderful with minimal drift in meaning, and this change in content has no bearing on the syntagmatic and syntactical formal structure. Despite this, the syntax hosting the choice of diction constitutes the content of the novel when considered physically. Now that I think about it, now I'm reading what my notes are, I don't think that I need to wait put this in. Maybe I can't put this in early, um, where it fits more naturally. It just seems like it's a little bit dense for for what I'm establishing at that point. I gotta just read some of what I have and see how it works, how it fits in. So introduction, I talk about the scope of art, then I talk about heathenism and expressivism as language games, um, more about language games, and then okay, so I introduce media. Um, I mean, I do introduce media in Marshall McLuhan right here. Maybe I could go right into an analysis of form and content. Yeah, I guess that's what I'll do. Okay, let me read what I have before leading into this. Because art is a pan-predicative block, it is like an effect without a cause. Art encompasses all phenomena like pure possibility and lacks a solid place within the world. The language game I choose to use when discussing aesthetics is that of media. Media is a better word than art for capturing the aims of aesthetics. Media embodies the appropriate scope of the speculative approach to aesthetics for defining what aesthetic experiences are and are about. Media is a twofold thing. Media is twofold thing. It always entails both the media itself and the medium it exists within. The human agent itself is a vessel or medium in which aesthetic experience arises as content. The categories of medium and message, or form and content, are the structure of media. According to Marshall McLuhan, the content of any medium is always another medium, showing how the categories are nested within each other and emerge from each other. There is no message without a medium, and there is no medium without a message. McLuhan defines the medium as any extension of ourselves. This places the human agent at the center of the media experience and contextualizes the media within the constraints of physicality, embodiment, intentionality, and phenomenology. Media facilitates the audience becoming one with the media phenomenon through extension. Okay, that all sounds good. Got to transition both into talking about formalism and medium and message. Okay. The medium and message discussed by McLuhan are the equiprimordial constitution of a piece of media. For an entity to be classified as a piece of media, extensionality human extensionality. Its human extensionality must trying to say they must pertain to content form because the art styles graph has two axes and their content form. So for something to be media, it must be somewhere on the graph. Interface. I don't know how to word this. Its extensionality must interface with it's like form and content are like faculties. When I'm trying to avoid using the word hylomorphic because it's philosophy jargon, but that's essentially what I'm trying to say. Is that like form and matter, form and content are they're equiprimordial. I'm already using jargon by saying equiprimordial because that's Heideggerian, but I don't want to say hylomorphic. Now, I don't want to say affordance, which is what I'm trying. Like I'm trying to say affordance, but I haven't introduced that word into the essay yet until later, which is why I was trying not to put this part of the essay so early. Writing a next video essay for this channel. It's on aesthetics or art. Okay, so the medium and message discussed by McLuhan are the equiprimordial constitution of a piece of media. For an entity to be classified as a piece of media, its human extensionality must interface with the structuring faculty of the world. Uh, okay, maybe I will introduce hylomorphism just for the sake of. I don't want to justify my system with an appeal to hylomorphism, but I could mention it just for the sake of philosophical completeness. Okay. So Aristotle developed doctrine Philo. Aristotle developed the doctrine of hylomorphism to explain I don't want to say constitution again, or I haven't said element. Um, Aristotle developed the doctrine of hylomorphism to explain the same relationship but within the application of physical objects. Hylomorphism states that physical objects are comprised of form and matter, which function concurrently to actuate the object in the world. An object must be made of something, which is its matter or content, but content is not sensible without a shape that contains it. Okay, but why do they apply? Physical objects are composed of matter and form, and media entities are composed of medium and message. So, a media entity is not a physical object. It can be ideal, it can be phenomenal rather than physical. So there must be something about the either the constitution of our mental faculties or of the structure of the external world that would make it such that these two elements have to be in place for everything, including things that are non physical. But I certainly don't want to go all Kantian and suggest that there's transcendental forms or anything like that. Okay, here's where I have to talk about Kant and formalism. I have to introduce formalism and then critique it, and I have notes over here for how I'm gonna critique it. Medium and message are a union. That's a good topic sentence. Medium and message are a union, and as equiprimordial elements of the media entity, neither can be divorced from the other. Despite this fundamental principle of media constitutionality, a dominant strand of aesthetic theory indicative of the analytic approach to art attempts to divorce one from the other, attempts to separate them, attempts The lineage of aesthetic theory is called This lineage of aesthetic theory is called formalism and originates from Immanuel Kant and his work Critique of Judgment. The formalist tradition honors the concept of significant form when making judgments of an aesthetic entity. This disposition Not only is formalism misguided in that it abandons a significant aspect of aesthetic experience, but it is functionally impossible and theoretically incoherent. For an example of this impossibility, consider the roles of form and content in the context of listening to spoken language. As media, spoken language is comprised of content and form. The form of spoken language is described by phonetics and acoustics, in which audible vibrations are structured physically and linguistically. The content of spoken language can be described by semantics, in which the phonetic occurrences are registered as instances of meaning. Try to hear someone speak in your native language and not understand it. Okay, so I'm talking about form and content, slash medium and message. There's a strand of thought in aesthetics called formalism that tries to say that the form of an art piece is the only thing that is important and the content is not important. And I disagree with this. So, I'm saying that form and content, medium and message are equiprimordial, which is a Heideggerian concept, meaning that they are equally primal or equally constitutive of something. Um, so I'm writing here. I'm giving the example of why it is not only wrong to favor form over content, but it's impossible because of the way form and content present themselves to, they disclose themselves to the viewer. So in the context of listening to someone speak your native language, it is more difficult to not understand what they're saying than it is to understand what they're saying, because the natural sense making faculty of the human constitution processes language into meaning. It processes content, semantic content, automatically. It's very difficult to not understand language if you're fluent in the language. Um, and then I'm gonna extend that to looking at even physical objects, for example. Um, like try to look at an apple and not know that it is an apple. It's I mean, I think that like if you're a hardcore meditator and you've like reached nirvana and you've trained your mind to like not see form and you realize that form is emptiness and all that, maybe it's possible to not know that an apple is an apple when you look at it, or to not know what the meaning of words are when you hear them. But that would take an extreme amount of power and meditative experience, and is not really possible for a normal person as far as I'm aware. So that's what I'm writing right now. I'm trying to think if I want to talk about intentionality in this context. So I'm saying that if you look at an object, you already know what the object is, you already know its message or its content, um, simply by looking at it because the mental process that categorizes the object is automatic. Um, so I could say that from a phenomenological perspective, our engagement with media is intentional, and therefore that intentionality um is like a fundamental aboutness that processes objects into semantic meaning or categories. But in my emotions analysis, systematizing emotions, that video, I talk a lot negatively about intentionality. But that of course is in the context of emotions. So I don't want to be confusing if I talk about intentionality in this context, but it could bolster what I'm saying. Okay, so I'm using the novel as an example of the way form and content are interrelated. So, when someone typically looks at a novel for aesthetic analysis and they think in terms of medium and message, they're gonna say something like the novel's medium is the novel form, and the content is the story. Um, but as far as my notes go, there's multiple nested levels of analysis, each comprised of medium and message that can be analyzed, that ultimately constitute the novel as a media or aesthetic entity. So instead of just looking at the immediate scope of saying it's a novel, it has a story, we can look really broad and say that the form of the novel is the technological and historical placement, um, and that the content is the physicality of the book. Then we engage one scope further and say that the form is the material and efficient actuality of the bound pages, and the content is the written language on those pages. And then we go one scope further and say that the form is the arrangement of words or the syntax, and the content is the semantic meaning of the words. So that's syntax and semantics. Then we go one scope further and we say that the form is the story structure, the plot, and the content is the episodic events of the story. Then we go one scope further and we say that the form is the mind or the substrate of experience, and the content is the phenomenal experience of engaging with the book. So that's five scopes, five levels of analysis. And the important part is that at each level, form becomes content, or content becomes form. And so when someone is in the Kantian or formalist tradition and they're trying to isolate form from content, they're ignoring the fact that that analysis only relevant at a single scope, and that when we think at a more meta-contextual level, form and content are not divorceable; they're interrelated, and they are each other. Form is content, content is form. Okay, so let's read what I got. Beyond the phenomenological entanglement of form and content in the media experience, form and content cannot be fully separated even in theoretical analysis. This is because the form of a media entity at one level of analysis may be the content of the same entity at another level of analysis. This nested relationship can be understood through the medium of the novel. When formalists analyze a novel, they fall into the temptation to assess its message and medium at an immediately recognizable scope that clouds their comprehension of how form and content interrelate across scope. That is to say, when analyzing a novel, one should recursively consider not just the apparent medium, such as being a novel, but also the meta-mediums that contain and contextualize that medium. At the broadest scope of analysis, the particular novel can be understood as a technological and historical artifact. The most general medium the novel is embedded within is history itself. The novel as a physical object could not exist if it was not created by historical forces that define the structural possibilities of the book. In this way, history is the medium of the novel, and the physicality of the manifest book is the historical message or content. The content of the physical form of the media must be accessed in order to reveal itself as form, carrying with it more nested content. The medium of a message is the meta message of formal containment. Hello. Yo, how's it going? I'm doing good. How about you? I'm working on a video essay. Next, a follow up to my art essay. No, not many viewers. This is my second time doing a stream. I did one a long time ago, but I don't expect many viewers. I'm just writing. I was just sort of bored, so I figured I'd stream, and if someone pops in and says something, then that's cool. If not, that's fine too. I'm writing about aesthetics. So about a year ago, actually like almost exactly a year ago, I made a video called Systematizing Art Styles. Um and that was really only a part of my broader aesthetic philosophical theory. Um but so this is basically part 2 to that, called Systematizing Aesthetics. And it extends that general idea into a more broad aesthetic domain, so that it analyzes like music and sculpture and photography, and like it reaches more mediums, because a big critique of that video that a lot of commenters said was that it was too focused on painting. And that is true to some extent. But I want to extend it. Have a good day, or have a good night. Thanks for stopping by. People criticize it for being too much about painting, and that's true, but it had to be too much about one medium, because the art graph is relative, and so if there's too many mediums, then the relational nature of the pieces on the art graph wouldn't really be clear. So in this video, I'm using the wheel of relation, which, if you've seen my motions video essay, I talk about the wheel of relation, which is basically a alternate version of the art graph from that video. And it allows analysis to be more interconnected, more relational. So for example, this Priester poster, which I used in our video, could be analyzed in terms of negentropy and connection. So like orderliness and harmony and simplicity, iconic nature. So those are the kind of characteristics of it. Whereas a piece like this is more calm and serene, so that would be in the release section. But it's also a little bit jagged and off kilter, so that would be entropy. And so this approach to analyzing art pieces has a lot of the same purpose and results as the system from that video, but it allows you to get a little bit more nuanced and fine-grained. And I think they work in tandem. And the point is to build a larger theory than what I presented in that video. So right now, where I'm writing about form and content, or alternatively medium and message. So I'm really influenced by a book called Understanding Media: Extensions of Man by Marshall McLuhan, which is a book from the 60s that really like pioneered media studies. And a big insight from that book is that the message of a medium is always another medium. So, for example, a movie is a medium, but a particular movie might have a novel as its content. Because if the story was adapted from a novel, then its content is the novel, which is a medium. And this is in contrast to formalism. So, in aesthetic theory, there's a tradition that's rooted in Kant called formalism that tries to favor form over content or medium over message. And I think that that approach to aesthetics is very misguided because it doesn't appreciate the fact that form and content are interrelated and nested within each other. So right now I'm writing about the novel as an example and how form and content or medium and message are nested within each other. So at the most general scope of analysis, the form of the novel is history itself, because the novel as a physical object is embedded in history. It has efficient causality that brought it into existence. But then you get one scope more specific, and then the form becomes the physicality of the book, the bound pages and whatnot, and the content is the written language that is embedded in the physical book, the English language, the typography, etc. But then you analyze it one step further, and you look at the written language instead of as content but as form, and then what you see is that syntax is the form of the language and semantics is the content of the language. And then you look at it one step further and you look at the semantics themselves, and the semantics have a form that is the story structure or the plot, and they have a content which is episodic events that make up the story. And so what I'm writing about here in this section of the video essay is just this nested form and content relationship, and I'm using that to argue that form and content or medium and message are equally important, and that the formalist tradition that tries to elevate form over content is just misguided. So that's what I'm writing about. The content of the physical form of the media must be accessed, and of the media entity. The content of the physical form of the media entity must be accessed in order to reveal itself as form, carrying with it more nested content. The medium of a message is the meta-message of formal containment. The next most definite scope of analysis contained within the media entity as a historical artifact is the medium of material and efficient actuality. The novel artifact has the content of physicality, and that physicality itself is a medium with formal characteristics. The physical book has the shape of a book, with pages made of paper bound together at the spine. Okay, so the level of analysis being considered in this paragraph is that of syntax and semantics. So the form of the written language is the or form of the language that is being considered phenomenologically is syntax, and the content is semantics. So we in the previous paragraph we said that the content was written language, and so we have to go from written language to the characteristics of language. So diction is the choice of words, which in semiotic theory would be considered paradigmatic. Um, and then syntax would be syntactical. Um, the paradigmatic syntactical distinction. I'm not wording this very well, I don't think. Within the medium of language, which is the content of the physical novel being considered, there exists the semantic content of words signified by linguistic form. This is the next level of nested mediums. The particular linguistic units of the novel's language are determined by diction. In semiotic terminology, diction is the author's paradigmatic selection of words. For example, fantastic may be substituted for wonderful with minimal drift in meaning, and this change in content has no bearing on the syntagmatic and syntactical formal structure of the language. Despite this, the syntax hosting the choice of diction constitutes the content of the novel when considered physically. The appearance of language on the page consists of marks or shapes which get their form from historical contingency, but when processed as linguistic phenomena, those marks take on the role of structuration called syntax. I think I'm conflating, or I'm struggling to separate the appearance of language from the linguistic meaning of language, or like the linguistic form of language, because the shapes of the letters, the typography is form, um but it's only when the written language is processed as a phenomena of language that syntax becomes the form. I'm gonna have to come back to this paragraph, I think, but I'm gonna move on to the next one. So after we consider the syntax and semantics of the written language of the novel, we move on to say that the form is the plot and the content is the episodic events. The semantic message of the novel in its totality is considered a plot or a story structure. The plot is the form of the story comprised of episodic events and characters, which are its content. Each event itself is structured with form as a necessary means for facilitating content. Characters can be analyzed archetypically to understand their formal relationship to broader categorical affordances of humanity, but this is only possible because of the instantiated messaging of the actions of the characters. You're back. Okay, so the last scope of analysis to consider when analyzing the novel is the experience itself. So when we can consider a piece of media or an art piece as an object, like a physical object, but what really makes it aesthetic is the experience of engaging with it. And so I often I think of um the ontology of, you know, being as being constituted by the phenomenal field, or at least the being of a human as being constituted by the phenomenal field, which is the totality of sense data, including mind, because mind is a sense. So when a media entity as a physical object is kind of meaningless because it's not aesthetic until it becomes an experience. And when it becomes an experience, it becomes part of the self, because a person is their phenomenal existence. They are their own phenomenal field. And when they engage with media, the media presents itself or is disclosed to the phenomenal field. So I mean, you could say that, like, if so, we're looking at syntax and semantics as, and then we look at plot and events, and then we look at the mind and phenomena on the mind, or the phenomenal field, and phenomena on the phenomenal field. And then we could even go further and think in terms of the content as, or is it the form that is the self, or is it the content that is the self? I mean, that's like the most, that's the root, the closest to the root scope that you can get, is saying that the media is yourself, because it is your phenomenal experience. And at that point, maybe form and content don't even operate. Maybe they break down. All right, I wrote about 3 pages. I'm gonna call the stream quits. Thank you to the few people who stopped by. I'm gonna turn this into video in the near future, so look out for that.